This is the American Law Journal.
The president has his nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court, but before the vote, is there still unfinished business to tend to? This week on the American Law Journal, will the Senate confirm Judge Neil Gorsuch, or will the legacy of Merrick Garland stand in the way? Gina Passarella has this.
What's at stake in this election? It's not just who goes here, it's who rules here, the Supreme Court.
Supreme Court appointments generally don't figure much into presidential elections. That wasn't the case in 2016. After Antonin Scalia's death last February, Barack Obama, with almost a year left in his presidency, nominated D.C. Circuit Judge Merrick Garland to fill that vacancy. Although hardly a unanimous choice,
meet Merrick Garland. Obama and his liberal allies have been working hard to paint Garland as a moderate for the Supreme Court.
The 64-year-old Garland was generally seen as a compromise.
Merrick Garland is a grand slam nominee for the Supreme Court.
Judge Garland is deeply experienced. He is seen by some as really the best pick that a Republican Senate could ask for from a Democratic president.
The president gets his ninth justice, but he does not get what he really wanted: Antonin Scalia's opposite number.
Even Republican Judiciary Committee member Orrin Hatch once called the judge a consensus choice and challenged President Obama to make Garland his nominee, which the president did. But shortly after, the Senate majority made a firm decision. No Obama nominees would be considered. No hearings would be held. Their rationale? The political environment was too toxic, and it should be left to the American people based on election results. That made the Supreme Court an even bigger issue in the presidential campaign.
If you really like Donald Trump, that's great. But if you don't, you have to vote for me anyway. You know why? Supreme Court judges.
It was a strategy that could have backfired on the Senate majority if Clinton had won. But with 2016's historic upset, Scalia's seat seemingly belongs to Trump and the Republicans. Or does it?
I think we have a major clash coming on the Gorsuch nomination, and it's reflected by Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley, who says that is a stolen seat.
Whether Gorsuch is qualified may be a moot point for some Democrats.
What the majority in the Senate has done is to basically steal that from one presidency and try to deliver it to another.
But if Democrats choose to filibuster the Gorsuch nomination, they could be facing this.
But if we end up with that gridlock, I would say, if you can, Mitch, go nuclear.
The nuclear option. Historically, the Senate requires a 60-vote filibuster-proof majority to confirm a Supreme Court justice. But the Senate could blow that up, meaning a simple majority could confirm Neil Gorsuch. Whether that comes to pass remains to be seen. But if it does, another time-honored American tradition may be in jeopardy. For the American Law Journal, I'm Gina Passarella.
All right, three guests with me tonight, and we're coming to you live, and anything can happen on live television and our feed from Washington, D.C., where we're supposed to have Carrie Severino join us tonight. Seems to have not materialized. If something changes, we'll let you know. But our guests with me tonight, George Badey is a plaintiff's attorney, former Democratic congressional candidate, one of the first legal boots on the ground in Florida in the Bush v. Gore matter in 2000. Senator Daylin Leach is a Democratic state senator from Pennsylvania and a contributor to the Huffington Post. And Mark Meuser is here with us tonight, a California attorney. He recently represented Donald Trump in presidential recounts in Wisconsin and in Michigan. He is a senior contributor to the Liberty Conservative. Before we get to some of Gorsuch's qualifications, let's listen to Sean Spicer. Here's what he had to say about the nomination process.
One of the things that's been a time-honored tradition in this country is that we recognize that the confirmation process is if you're the default is that if you're qualified for the position, then you should be confirmed, not the other way around. And I think that so a time-honored tradition is what Sean Spicer said there, and that if you're qualified for the position, you should be confirmed. So, Mark, if that's the principle we're living by, and hopefully we're still living by principles in Washington, D.C., why isn't Merrick Garland a Supreme Court justice today?
The reason why Merrick Garland is not a Supreme Court justice is the United States Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, Paragraph 2. By and with advice and consent of the Senate. It is not Obama's nomination. It does not belong to Obama. It belongs to Obama plus the Senate equals a Supreme Court justice. And we saw during the Reagan administration, the Democrats used that advice and consent and took out Robert Bork. It's not done very often, but there is precedent for it.
All right, it may be true whether it's Estrada or Bork, and we can complain about those issues, but eventually a president does get a nomination shot, if you will, that we have had 103 Supreme Court justices approved in a row. Here, where nominee was put forward, but no hearings, no confirmation hearing. Don't you have a problem with that?
This is not the first time that this has happened. George Bush named several nominees to a court of appeals, and the Senate Democrats did not give him even hearings for this.
Right,
So
and we're going to get into that, especially with the federal judiciary, because we're going to get into Harry Reid and the nuclear option, which again Gina brought up in the package, and the chickens may have come home to roost. But obviously, Mr. Badey, you don't agree.
Absolutely don't agree. I mean, this is the first time in American history that the party that controlled the Senate just flat out did not give a hearing. So I respectfully disagree with Mark. This has never happened before, and the hypocrisy of it and the challenge to our constitutional values and what America is all about was tested last year. So I think that now when we're looking at what's going on, we need a way of healing these wounds, and we need a way of going about this which is not so partisan.
But let me interrupt for just a minute, because you know, if Democrats are so upset now, why weren't they this upset 10 months ago when maybe something could have been done? But it seems that maybe, and Senator Leach, maybe Democrats got a little complacent. Maybe they thought that Hillary Clinton was going to become president, and they figured, okay, we'll deal with it later. Big problem, could have been a big mistake.
Well, no, that's not what happened. What happened is that the Republicans simply said no matter what you do, no matter who you nominate, they're not going to get a vote. It's important for people to understand the history here. The average time between a nomination and a vote on a Supreme Court nominee in modern times is about 70 days. President Obama had well over 300 days to nominate Judge Garland, nominated a consensus choice that even Republicans historically had liked, but they were told under no circumstances are we holding a hearing. That is literally the theft of a Supreme Court seat, and the Democrats cannot be complicit in that now. Now, there is a compromise. When we had a similar situation in Pennsylvania, and I was concerned as chair of the Judiciary Committee that Governor Corbett was going to nominate an extreme candidate, I came up with a list of 5 judges, all Republicans, but moderate, reasonable people who I said we would vote to confirm, and no one else.
That's my point, though, Daylin. My point is, why didn't Democrats do that earlier? Now they find themselves in a vice. They're stung by the fact that they didn't get their nominee. They didn't get a hearing. Now they're stuck with someone that may be an excellent jurist, but someone who's very conservative. Plus, they look weak. Haven't they acted late in the game?
No, because there was nothing they could have done. I mean, we had the ability to block, but you don't have the ability in the minority to push something forward. The floor is controlled by the majority party. They would refuse to bring Judge Garland to a vote, and there was no compromise candidate. If we wanted a compromise candidate, that would have been Judge Garland. This was a complete intransigence, and it violated the basic foundations. I mean, keep in mind, Abe Fortas, who was nominated as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, had ethical issues and was ultimately not confirmed.
Yeah.
He had his vote in October of a presidential election year. Ronald Reagan got Anthony Kennedy in a Democratic-controlled Senate confirmed in 1988, a presidential election year. This idea is, well, presidents, we're going to wait to see what happens. Just one more point, which is that we know that that's not the rule, because even now when they ask Kellyanne Conway or other members of the Trump administration, are you saying that you don't expect any justices confirmed in the last year of your term? They're like, well, no, we're not saying that. They're going to clearly expect a justice confirmed. This no president gets a nominee their last year is not a thing in America, and it's not going to be a thing going forward for the Republicans. It was only to steal this particular seat.
Mark, they didn't want to give anyone a hearing. No nominee. In other words, no nominee that Obama would put forward was going to be good enough. And again, as you saw in the feature report, Orrin Hatch said, if he came up with a consensus choice, like, oh, I don't know, a Merrick Garland, we would listen to that. Isn't it tougher to make the argument that this was done in good faith when you hear that Mitch McConnell says anyone that a Hillary Clinton puts forth, we're not going to give them a hearing, we're not going to give them a confirmation.
But move back to Garland, it was actually a favor to not run the hearings on Garland. We have all seen over the last 30 years how partisan Supreme Court picks can be made. And Bork, after being borked by the Democrat Senate, he ended up resigning shortly thereafter. Had they gone through with the hearings, knowing full well that the Republicans were just going to en masse vote him down, and he would have gone through all those partisan hearings, it was actually a benefit to Garland's career. Now, if in 4 years from now, you can have a Democrat come in, maybe who wins 2020, and he would now be somebody that they could select again. So the fact is, the Republicans had decided.
They did it for Garland, for Merrick Garland.
Well, the thing is, the Republicans had decided that this was not going to be somebody that they were going to vote for. This was going to be a game-changing nomination. You're getting rid of one of the most conservative Supreme Court.
And that's probably what it really boils down to, right?
Wow. Chris, that's not remotely what happened. I mean, first of all, a number of Republican senators said they wanted to vote for Judge Garland, or at least on Judge Garland. Mitch McConnell made the decision that wouldn't happen. But keep in mind, I mean, Bork was rejected, as were some other justices in the past, because he had extreme views. A Democratic-controlled Senate confirmed Clarence Thomas, confirmed Antonin Scalia 98-0. It's not like Democrats say we're not confirming anyone, or even any conservative. But the Republicans said that Merrick Garland, who again, as you put it, is about as conservative as a Republican can expect from a Democratic president, and would have gotten plenty of votes, and in a normal year probably would have been confirmed unanimously, was not even given the courtesy of a vote. That wasn't a favor to him.
Well, I would like to challenge that. I mean, Merrick Garland was 18 months before he was even appointed to the Court of Appeals. How can you say that he was not going to be controversial? It took him 18 months to get through the first time based upon how controversial he was.
It's not true. It wasn't based on how controversial he was. It was based on the fact that Republicans were slow-walking judicial nominees. Again, Orrin Hatch said this is the perfect nominee from a Democratic president. If you look at his record, it is a moderate record. You don't expect a Democrat to nominate a Scalia, but I mean, again, this is a consensus choice like we don't typically have in America. Plus, he's 64 years old.
He wasn't a consensus choice, because just take a look.
What was the final vote in his confirmation? Do you remember?
I don't.
It was unanimous.
But it was in 18 months. It was very partisan because he had very partisan beliefs.
No.
Obama selected a person that he had 8 months to get through the judicial nominating process, and this guy had taken 18 months the first time. That's Obama's problem.
And just so you understand, too, Neil Gorsuch railed against the Senate back in 2002 because he felt that two justices had gotten a raw deal. One was Justice Roberts, the other one was Justice Garland. So he felt that they were grossly mistreated. It's kind of ironic now that we find ourselves in this position, because this is when we started to see that kind of gridlock in Washington. And I would agree that it was happening on both sides. But, you know, the irony here, Mark, is that maybe Neil Gorsuch would probably lend some sense of kudos to Merrick Garland. Obviously, he thinks he's an exceptional jurist. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have gone to bat for him.
Well, you know, he is I'm not going to argue that he's not a good jurist. He is partisan, though. And anybody who says he was nonpartisan or a consensus choice has not looked at Garland's prior record before he was nominated to the Court of Appeals. It was very partisan. There was a reason why he was being slow-walked, just like Justice Roberts was slow-walked at the same time. They both had very partisan records that resulted in them being slow-walked.
Again, just because history matters, none of that is true. He wasn't slow-walked because of any flaw in his record. He was slow-walked because he was being nominated to the D.C. Court of Appeals, the D.C. Circuit, which historically handles most of the federal litigation. The Republicans did not want a Democratic majority on the D.C. Circuit. So they opposed all the Democratic nominees. In fact, Harry Reid ended the filibuster for Court of Appeals nominees because they wouldn't confirm 3 specific appellate court judges to the D.C. Circuit. It had nothing to do with Merrick Garland. No one's ever complained about Merrick Garland.
Go ahead, George, a comment.
You know, I sit here and day after day after day, we get shocked by the things that Donald Trump says. And now Mark just said something that's new, a new thing, saying they did him a favor by not holding a hearing. Wow. Another alternative fact. I mean, Mark was involved in the litigation. He represented Donald Trump in Michigan, I believe, and in Wisconsin also. So here's the guy right here on the set with us that represented Donald Trump and stood up in court, in a court of law, representing President Trump, saying out loud, there's been no voter fraud whatsoever. Please don't disturb the results in those 2 states. And now since then, your client President Trump is saying all over TV that the whole election was rigged. There's millions and millions of illegal votes. No president in American history has ever undermined the electoral process like President Trump. No president in American history has called judges, so-called judges, undermine the separation of powers. We are headed for a constitutional crisis of proportions that we've never seen before. And I think it's time that the people that were with Trump say, wait a minute, he better really rein himself in before things get bad.
And does it concern you the way, and let's switch gears here a little bit, the way the president is treating the judiciary, whether it was the Mexican-American judge who was going to rule in the Trump University case or the quote-unquote so-called judge in the travel ban? Does it give you pause of how he may approach the judiciary and whether he will listen to judges, including maybe a Neil Gorsuch if he is confirmed?
Well, I think everybody's going to have their own opinion about what Trump thinks, and everybody has an opinion about what he says. I'm not here in the capacity that I'm not Donald Trump's attorney here today, so I cannot speak to that, and I'm not going to speak to that.
Just as an American, as a person who loves the Constitution, you got a great tie on tonight. So I know that that's near and dear to your heart. Would a Neil Gorsuch be an effective check on the executive?
I actually think he is going to be an effective check. I mean, if you've studied his opinions and some of what he said, it sounds like he is going to be an individual who is going to not allow an executive branch to run over the Constitution. He has indicated that the Chevron deference standard may be something that he is willing to re-examine. And as somebody who really does not like the direction that the federal bureaucracy has gone in regulations, that is something I really like about Gorsuch, is his willing to go relook at that Chevron deference standard.
He's a far-right ideologue. If he gets on the court and things happen certain ways, Roe versus Wade could go away. Abortion could become a state-by-state issue. It could be illegal in many states. He is a far-right ideologue on issues that relate to the environment. He voted on Hobby Lobby. I mean, I'll let Senator Leach jump in, but this guy is a far-right ideologue. What should happen here is the Republican Senate should say, whoa, whoa, whoa. We need to heal this nation. We need to heal the nation from these horrible wounds that have been inflicted. It's time for us to turn to the Democrats on the Senate and do just what they did in Pennsylvania and say, give us 5, give us 10 Republican judges in our federal system that you'd be okay with confirming. And then let President Trump pick from those, and you'd have a 99 to nothing vote.
Incidentally, when I did that in Pennsylvania, the governor wound up picking one of my 5 choices, Justice Corey Stevens, who served with distinction. But I want to answer Chris's original question because it's such an important question. When Donald Trump says that a judge, a so-called judge has blood on his hands or whatever he's been saying the last couple of days, it is horrific from a democracy perspective. The only thing that prevents us from having a dictatorship is an independent judiciary, because when the executive goes too far, the judiciary says, no, that's too far, and that keeps them in check. When Donald Trump tries to delegitimize the only checks on his power being an independent judiciary and the press, it is very scary in terms of both what his intentions are with regards to the limits of his power and to the future of democracy. This is really something that even Republicans should speak out against if we care about leaving our kids as something that our founders would recognize.
Go ahead, Mark.
Today is Ronald Reagan's birthday. And Scalia was one of the most lasting impacts that we've had from the Ronald Reagan administration. He is, I will agree, one of the most conservative justices that the Supreme Court has had in the last 30 years. Scalia is gone. Even if Gorsuch is as conservative as Scalia is, it's not going to change the Supreme Court. It's not going to change Roe v. Wade. It's not going to change anything because that vote will be the same. I find it a little hard to believe that Gorsuch can be as conservative as Scalia. And so pretty much anybody that Donald Trump named was going to be less than what Scalia knew.
Gorsuch was actually a clerk to both Kennedy and Byron White, which is kind of interesting. But the interesting thing, Mark, is that we were told that, again, Merrick Garland couldn't get a fair hearing because the atmosphere was too toxic and we should let the American people decide. Couldn't the argument be made that the atmosphere is even more toxic now? And if we let the American people decide, couldn't it be argued that more people voted for Hillary Clinton than for Donald Trump. And is that the American people speaking? I mean, this seems to be a standard or a metric that was made up out of whole cloth. But if you want to go ahead and justify that, then you have to take the second step and say, the atmosphere is more toxic. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote.
Well, the thing is, we don't elect our president, and we've never have elected our president based upon the popular vote.
Well,
and there's
right.
what, 32 states
Well,
that voted for Trump.
I'm not arguing that the Electoral College chooses the president, but you see my point.
Well, yeah. I would say that first of all, apparently now we're going to have the Electoral College choose Supreme Court justices, which I see nothing about in the Constitution. But at the end of the day, this isn't about the mechanism. This is about fairness in the system. We have a Supreme Court that was stolen, and frankly, to be honest with you, when they talk about the nuclear option, I'm for that. Progressives have never liked the filibuster, and if we have to have Judge Gorsuch on the court, let's at least get something for it. So when there is, as Mark pointed out, in the future a Democratic president, they can just get their nominees confirmed. They don't have to deal with the filibuster.
So Senator Leach, you would then tell Democratic senators, regardless of what McConnell and the Republican majority do, filibuster anyway, and if they use the nuclear option, so be it.
I think there's only two circumstances under which the president under which the Democratic senators should cooperate on the Supreme Court nominee. Number one is if Donald Trump renominates Merrick Garland, because that's who deserves to be on the Supreme Court, or if there's a negotiation where, again, the Democrats say, here's 5 or 6 names, pick one of those names, and Trump agrees to do that. And there's a consensus choice. Because, again, the idea that people vote on the Supreme Court in presidential elections is preposterous. I'm a politician.
Well, I have to say, but it was more important this year than ever before.
It was still, if you poll it, when you polled it, what is the most important issue to you? The economy, character, right, whatever. Supreme Court would be about 15th or 16th at 1%.
Yeah, but right before that election day, there were lots of commercials and there was a lot of push to talk about that specific issue. I want to roll something in, because this is actually something that's been taped recently by a former Supreme Court justice, but it seems like it came from a kinder, gentler time.
There was a time, believe it or not, where everybody tried to be civil, even though they might disagree fundamentally at the bottom line. And political discourse in those days was meant to really solve problems, not create new ones. And we'd like to...
Don't you think that the Garland affair and the Gorsuch affair demonstrates how far apart we are, and what kind of loggerheads we're at, and we're getting to a point, I don't want to say of no return, but this chasm is becoming so wide that it may become more and more difficult to bridge.
I think we have a situation right now where
the
beginning of the Trump administration has started, and every single day we're seeing more crazy things. People are saying, gee, maybe he's not mentally stable, maybe he's this or that. If Donald Trump and the Republican Party want to recapture any legitimacy that they may have, it's time for them to stand up and do that. It's time for the Republicans in the Senate to say to Donald Trump, you know what? We need to show the country that we're reaching across the aisle, that we're trying to, rather than shove Gorsuch down everybody's throat, they need to do this other option that Senator Leach talked about and pick 5 or 6 good judges, Republican judges, reasonable judges that both sides can agree on. We need to start healing the wounds that this election caused. And this is a way to do it, and they should do it now.
Well, I'm going to disagree. If you study American history, there really has never been a time where politics have not been partisan. You come up with an issue, the nation's going to be divided, they're going to be talking about it. And the one thing I've learned in studying presidential biographies and reading about great statesmen throughout the years is that political fighting happens and America has gone on. The thing is, I also don't like the filibuster. If you want to filibuster, get on the Senate floor and actually go debate your principles and hold the floor. And if you can't hold the floor, then let the vote go on. This whole thing, the Byrd rule, this is not long-standing tradition of the Senate. This is modern tradition. I will agree, get rid of the filibuster. You still have the filibuster. If you can hold the floor, you can hold the floor.
The filibuster was put in there so that, for things such as Supreme Court justices, we don't want to have extremists. So that's why 60 votes was determined. I know you don't agree, Daylin.
I was going to say that, It is true. Mark's right. We've always been partisan, but there's always been limits to that partisanship. For example, there are mores that we go by. It's like playing basketball without a ref. You sort of call fouls on each other, but you do it fairly. Historically, one party has not used the fact that they have a temporary majority to try to pass legislation and do things like this to lock in a permanent majority. You know, there was a time there were 88 Democratic senators, 88 to like 11 after the 36 election. We could have passed anything we wanted. But we didn't. But now with things like not confirming Supreme Court justices, the gerrymandering, the voter suppression, today we passed something in Pennsylvania designed to stop Democratic groups from contributing to campaigns, but not Republican groups from contributing to campaigns. When you do that, you undermine, in fact, very quickly, there was a movement to even gerrymander the Electoral College and award the votes by congressional districts, which are gerrymandered, and we know who will win them. That would make presidential elections non-competitive. If we do stuff like that, and like what we did with Merrick Garland, we cease being a functional democracy. It can't always be my side has to win, no matter how much damage it does to what our founders envisioned.
I told you we'd go quickly. We are out of time, folks. I want to thank George Badey, again, plaintiff's attorney from Philadelphia, former Democratic congressional candidate, Senator Daylin Leach. All these years later, Daylin, we finally got a chance to get together, a Democratic state senator from Pennsylvania, and Michael Meuser, who recently represented Donald Trump in presidential recounts in Wisconsin and Michigan. He's a senior contributor to the Liberty Conservative. Sorry, Carrie Severino from the Judicial Crisis Network couldn't be with us tonight. Maybe at some future day for all of us here at ALJ. Thanks for joining us. Until next Monday night. Case closed.
This week's American Law Journal is made possible in part by Law Catalyst, video and film production for the legal profession. Go to lawcatalyst.com. King Spry, serving its Pennsylvania clients in family law, business, personal injury, and school law for over 30 years. Blank Rome, providing strategic advice for employers in today's workplace. Badey, Sloan, and DiGenova, providing consumer protection in injury matters for over 30 years. Swartz Cullington PC, a personal injury law firm that concentrates on safeguarding the wounded. Get the justice you deserve. And The Legal Intelligencer, the oldest law journal in the United States.